Please welcome Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer for the Human Rights Foundation, and Rasmus Klein, Director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. This session will be moderated by Angie Lau, Founder and Editor-in-Chief of Forecast News.
What an incredible number of sessions and conversations that we have all taken in. The stories that we heard this morning really underscore the value and the importance of what we're about to talk about right now. The pen oftentimes can be mightier than the sword, a very important tool of journalism. And there are other tools as well in our weaponry, as it were. And the question we're going to ask in this conversation is, can Bitcoin, crypto, and blockchain aid media freedom and support journalism? And if the images of Ukraine and the powerful stories by Alkis Konstantinidis in his work as a photojournalist doesn't really reflect the magnitude of it, I don't know what will. So in this session, I'm thrilled to explore this with our two very esteemed panelists today in a fireside chat. Rasmus is the director at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, professor of political communication at the University of Oxford, and your research is focused on the changing role of news and media in our societies, and I think we are all students of that here in this room. We also have Alex Gladstein. He is Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation, also served as Vice President of Strategy for the Oslo Freedom Forum since its inception in 2009. And in your body of work, Alex, you've connected hundreds of dissidents and activists with business leaders, technologists, journalists, philanthropists, policymakers to promote free and open societies, and really interested to explore how Bitcoin and crypto and blockchain and Web3 technologies can further enhance this work. And it's great to be here. I'm Angie Lau, journalist just like you, but focused very much on this space and revealing, hopefully, more than the headlines that we're often bombarded by. So it is great to have you both. For this audience, let's unpack it a little bit. Alex, I want to start with you first. When people ask you about Bitcoin, what do you say, and what is their reaction, especially tied in the work that you do?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be here. Thank you for moderating this, and thanks to our generous hosts and to my co-panelists. It depends on who they are. If someone comes from an authoritarian regime or a collapsing economy, and I tell them there's money that the government doesn't control, they're very interested in learning more. If they come from New York or London or Tokyo or LA, and I tell them there's money that the government doesn't control, they look at me and they're like, that's kind of sketchy. This sounds like a criminal matter, you know. So it really depends on your level of financial privilege. If you live in a society that has hyperinflation, or you are an activist who's had a frozen bank account, or you've been sanctioned and can't access fintech that you and I use every day, then it sounds really appealing and you want to learn more. And that's who I spend most of my time talking to, are the folks that we support around the world, independent investigative journalists and civil society leaders. And they are not just interested, they are increasingly using Bitcoin and stable coins mainly, operationally, in their work today. As most of you know here, if you're running a media organization in a difficult political climate, you may not want the government to know that you've gotten a bank wire from a foreign organization. That may be illegal. It may break a foreign agent law. It may trespass any number of unfair laws, but they're laws, right? So it's really neat to be able to receive the money in a way that's peer-to-peer and that the government can't stop and knows a lot less about. So again, people's reactions, will depend on where they come from, But I think we're working towards a place where people are beginning to really understand how important this is. And I'm sure we'll get into it as well, but I think specificity about what we're talking about is really important. You know, I'm observing people using basically Bitcoin and stablecoins, particularly Tether and to a lesser extent USDC, when they're like basically asking to be paid in a currency that the government doesn't control. I haven't seen very much in the way of like, well, let's say Web3 helping, and I'm much less sanguine about that. But I think we should be like quite specific about what we're talking about.
I'd love to, I'm just out of curiosity, I'm just super interested for those of you in the room. How many of you own, show of hands, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency?
Not great operational security.
Can we see a show of hands? It looks like a fraction. I would say probably 5%.
One out of 5 Americans has owned Bitcoin or cryptocurrency.
So here's the thing. I think we all come from a very incredible part of the world where freedoms exist, access to financial services and products exist. Those of us who have Bitcoin crypto, it's probably part of a portfolio of assets that you know we were in. And yet, Alex, as you speak about it, for a predominant part of the world in developing nations, in nations under crisis, in emerging economies, this is not part of a portfolio. This is not something that is speculative or to dabble in. This is life or death. Rasmus, I'd love to hear how you think about the emergence of this technology, especially in the age of how media has evolved from Web 2, from internet, and now going into Web 3. How do you think about this emerging technology that underscores our work?
I think we need to sort of start with keeping in our heads two things at the same time. One is that the aspiration of journalism remains timeless. It is to seek truth and report it. And that the major challenges facing that aspiration around the world today, I think, can be sort of usefully simplified and exaggerated into 3 big challenges. One is powerful people who do not want professionals to seek truth and report it because they find it inconvenient, unwelcome, annoying, frustrating, even dangerous to their various plans and aspirations. We heard very powerfully about that earlier today. The second one is the question of funding. Journalism as a profession is not an avocation. There needs to be sustainable business models. Historically, these have primarily been for-profit. I think they realistically will remain in the near-term and long-term future primarily for-profit in most of the world. What does that look like? And the third one is, what does it mean for journalism to create value for citizens and to earn and maintain their trust in an environment that people are often turned off actually existing journalism. They often are attuned to opinion leaders and politicians and others who tell them that everything is fake news, that it's misinformation, you should trust me, rather than these people who hold me to account, and who may find a lot of what conventional journalism reports as frankly being quite depressing and not that useful and not that relevant to their lives. These are the 3 big ones, I think. None of them are purely technical challenges, and that also, I think, means that anyone who tries to argue that any one of them have a purely technical solution is either naive or willfully ignorant and or trying to sell you something. Now, in that context, I think journalism has a long history of trying to make use of the best available tools to pursue the aspiration. Steve Haskell spoke this morning about the trust principles that underlie the work at Reuters and Thomson Reuters and the Foundation. That includes the 5th principle, the commitment to spare no expense at using the best available tools to practice journalism. And I think in that context, even though none of these problems are purely technical problems, and none of them will have purely technical solutions, every tool can help if used well. And as Alex rightly says, I think if we want to assess the relative importance of something like Bitcoin, we need to get very specific. Because we've had a lot of sort of folks over the years say that, oh, the tablet will save journalism, or crypto will save journalism, or Second Life will save journalism. It's not called Second Life these days, is it? Whatever it's called will save journalism.
Metaverse.
And I think we need to get very specific about these things if we want to seriously assess the utility of a tool, rather than just listen to people who promote it because they want to sell it to us.
Well, let's unpack that, because I think that what you're saying is very powerful. But at the same time, you have, the timeless words of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. And we've seen that evolve in many, many facets. Social media certainly is one. But in your view, this question is for both of you, if the medium is this technology, how does that change or impact the ability of us to tell our stories?
I mean, I agree completely with what Rasmus is saying, and we need to be realistic, a little cynical, and kind of conservative about how we look at these things. And I would say that at the moment, it's just bucket number one for me, for what I've seen. This helps people tell the truth that powerful folks don't want them to tell, by allowing them to keep their operations going when their bank account gets frozen. It's pretty simple. There are tons of journalists out there. In fact, my organization made a grant recently to Novaya Gazeta Europe in Bitcoin, because it's hard for them to accept a bank wire. This is a basic administrative, operational issue at the moment. This is not about fixing journalism or any sort of grandiose claim. This is a very simple thing. Hey, I need to get some money from my donor, and I need to pay somebody, and I can't use the banking system. So from what I've seen, Bitcoin and stablecoins are an excellent solution to this. I mean, they can literally fix this in certain cases, and in many growing cases. Look, 10 years ago, it was very different. There was no liquidity for Bitcoin. It wasn't really a solution. But today, I mean, look, in Ukraine, there are Telegram bots that allow you to exchange thousands of dollars of Bitcoin for hryvnia or local currency within minutes with no ID. That's extremely helpful if you're a journalist there, for example, and taking money from the outside. So for people inside, again, conflict zones, dictatorships, humanitarian aid, crisis zones, it can be very helpful. And I would be very, very wary of any bigger grandiose claims that, whether it be cryptocurrency broadly or one of the tokens specifically, is going to fix journalism. I very much doubt that.
I mean, it speaks to the sustainability of the newsroom, but also the sustainability of independent journalists to be able to do their jobs. We heard from Dimitri this morning about, let's start a fund for these exiled journalists, not only from Russia, from around the world, who have a perspective that is equally as important as those who are functioning in functioning newsrooms. How do you see the sustainability angle when we talk about access to funds?
Well, I mean, again, to sort of boil it down to a single observation, I think a simple way to think about the changes in the business of journalism is that historically, the problem that journalists solved, or rather the companies that employed them, the news media solved, was the scarcity of information. And if I can be a little bit blunt, that's a problem that no one has anymore. I mean, obviously that's an exaggeration. There are many people who have a scarcity of credible information, or information that's relevant to their lived experience or their community. We have issues around news assets. We have real issues around the credibility and independence of reporting in many parts of the world, where media capture is a real issue. But in terms of raw access to stuff, I doubt that very many internet users wake up in the morning thinking, gee, I really wish there was more stuff on the internet. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the value that news media can create has to be different today, right? It has to be value that's created in the context of information abundance rather than information scarcity. And I think we are seeing news organizations that are doing the hard work of trying to adapt to that while continuing to run the legacy businesses that they have to run to keep the lights on, to keep their journalists employed, and to continue to serve existing audiences, which is well worth and incredible to serve. But it is a fundamentally different environment. And I think that is, in many parts, a work that has to be done inside the profession and the industry itself. There is no one else in society who will take responsibility for the question of evolving the business of news and ensuring sustainable funding models for journalism. Yes, in some countries, perhaps the government might want to step in to support. Yes, in some of the countries in which the government might be willing to do that, we might also have confidence that that help is not just a form of media capture or a tool for that. But those countries are, let's be clear, few. We live in a time of democratic recession. So as challenging as it is, I think it has to be on journalists and news media to evolve towards sustainable business models. We all need to recognize that you'll miss us when we're gone is not a business model. And society needs us is not a business model. Societies need lots of different things that they don't get. And journalists didn't think much about that before. It was their industry and their profession that was under pressure. But I will say, I think we are really seeing now the green shoots of what that looks like. I think in many ways, while a lot of individual titles are in a difficult place, and we are seeing continued job losses that are very hard for those who lose their jobs and for those who have to say goodbye to really valued and good colleagues. But while it is in a difficult and challenging environment, and of course a recession might well be coming up that will make it more so, I think we're also seeing the green shoots. We're seeing both digital-born entrants that are really successful in building up sustainable business models, whether it's Mediapart in France, El Diario in Spain, then again in Slovakia, Malaysia Kini in Malaysia, or others, or for that matter, legacy titles, upmarket general newspapers that have been willing to invest in digital and in product and in audience in addition to into their journalism, increasingly are doing well. And in that sense, plus of course, all the really inspiring new forms of editorial work, like Bellingcat that we heard about earlier today, that does things that are journalistic in an entirely new and incredibly valuable way that all of us, I think, really benefit from. Fact checkers, Our World in Data. There are many examples of this, forensic architecture and others. So I think we're seeing a lot of green shoots, but it is against the backdrop of an industry and a profession that has to recognize that the business models that work in the 20th century are broken because they don't solve problems anymore, and the journalism as a profession and the news industry as a business has to focus on the problems people actually have rather than the problems they used to have.
Well, that is also speaking to, I wonder if it's also speaking to what people think they need versus, many of us from a generation to not assume that we know what we need, that we need to expose ourselves to bigger and grander ideas. And at the end of the day, when we have this technology that allows us to be immutable, to have peer-to-peer access, and maybe decentralize what we've all come to know as a very centralized media behemoth and organization, how can decentralization affect and impact journalism?
Well, I mean, to speak to what was said this morning, both to the harrowing stories of how authoritarians are going after media outlets through legal attacks and all sorts of, pressure. One of the first things they do is they try to freeze your bank account to try to prevent you from paying your employees so that, it thwarts your work. And to speak to what Dimitri said about his vision of having a big fund that could support meaningful open source investigative journalism, you wouldn't want that in a currency or in a banking system that the government can just freeze. You want that to be sovereign, right? And for us at the Human Rights Foundation, the first time we saw any sort of practical application for Bitcoin, it was a long time ago, but it was this idea of a very large, powerful government wanting to freeze the bank account of an investigative journalist, and that's the case with WikiLeaks, right? So we saw the U.S. government try to cut off one of an organization that was whistleblowing against it, setting this really chilling trend. And they were like, hey, we're going to use this new technology. Of course, this was in 2011, and people kind of scoffed at it. But hey, if you talk to the team there, that was very important for them over the years, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Fast forward to 2013, and we were approached by some Ukrainian activists in the fall of 2013 who wanted to do a Bitcoin fundraiser because their bank accounts had been like basically closed, monitored by Yanukovych at the time. And we were like, I don't know. It's kind of a weird ask, but we were open-minded about it. We said, why not? And it worked to our surprise, and it's worked ever since. And I think it really just speaks to this idea of, again, governments going for the obvious. Like when you speak to Navalny's team, for example, the Russian government, before it declared the Anti-Corruption Foundation a terrorist entity, and before it basically drove them out of the country, they would periodically and frequently freeze the bank account and drain the funds of the Navalny team. So in 2015, Leonid, who's like the sort of number 2 there, he started accepting Bitcoin, and it's been really important to them. It's been between 10 and 20% of their donations every month since then. And it was helpful because it's like a bank account that Putin couldn't freeze. It was like very, very important for them. So, we tried to do our homework, and, today I think it's important to understand like the context where there's literally more than 100 million people using this technology. And it's kind of hard to get exact numbers, but if you look at exchanges, you can get a decent idea of what user bases are in different countries. There are more people using Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in a peer-to-peer way, without ID, without exchanges. They do it through WhatsApp and Telegram, etc. So you want to increase the estimate when you're thinking about these things. But for example, the government of Indonesia reported 12 million cryptocurrency users last month. So you're probably looking at 20 million people in that country using this. You look at Nigeria, there's like 10, 15, 20 million people there. India, 50 million. 1 in 5 Americans, that's 60 million. So we're talking about a really large number of people that use this technology. But it hasn't really picked up in the activist world until recently, I think, in a bigger way. And we've started to see it. I mean, the feminist coalition in Nigeria relied on Bitcoin 2 years ago when their accounts got, basically pressured by the Nigerian government. The Belarusian opposition movement has relied on Bitcoin in a pretty big way ever since the summer of 2020, as they were funding striking workers and unions and journalists. It's something we've implemented, and we've helped get Bitcoin in there. And then, of course, what I mentioned with Russia. So, and even a place like Hong Kong. Like I've talked to Hong Kongers, and they now live in Europe, and they're trying to do work in Hong Kong, and they can't pay somebody in Hong Kong with a bank wire. No way. So they use Bitcoin. They don't necessarily want to use it. They don't necessarily have any ideological love for this thing. It's kind of annoying. It's volatile. It doesn't work all the time. It's not familiar. But guess what? It's like a last resort thing. It's a plan B. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, and let's use it to our advantage.
I think what we're hearing is from really both ends of the spectrum. We're talking about the sustainability of journalism, right? From a business corporate perspective, from a monetization perspective, and then the existential crisis of what happens when I can't have access to funds and I'm still trying to do my work. So we have these two far spectrums. In the middle is, if media is the thing that gets us to freedom and democracy and all the things that we collectively and universally hold dear. In both your views, from your perspectives, how can crypto play that role to ease the flow of funds if money is power and the cessation of money means that you are more powerful because I've weaponized it against you? How, in this world of ours, can we think about crypto and Bitcoin and blockchain beyond what we're all really super familiar with, perhaps less so at Forecast because we cover it every day, but the counterfactual to this is terrorist financing, this is the tool for criminals, this is all about the dark web and all of those nasty things that we often hear about that have people hesitate about this technology.
Well, I want to hear what Rasmus has to say, but I would look, it's like encryption. Bad guys can use it too, and they do, but you have to think about proportions. So I saw a Wired article the other day that said some pro-Russian forces had raised about $4 million in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Okay, guess what? The Ukrainian government raised over $100 million. You know, so you have to think about proportions, and you have to think about the fact that dictators hate this thing. Putin signed a law personally this summer outlawing Bitcoin and cryptocurrency from being used in payments in Russia. The CCP banned citizens from exchanging RMB for Bitcoin in 2017, and they banned Bitcoin mining last year. They don't like something that they don't control. Now, some of the smaller rogue regimes may be able to use it for this or that purpose, but they don't want their citizens using it. So, I mean, I think we should be clear-eyed about the fact that it's like encryption. Anybody can use it, including the bad guys, but it's also like encryption in that you're missing the forest for the trees if you're focusing on a couple bad actors here or there. The reality is that, like, we are stronger as humans and as societies if individuals can have checks against arbitrary power. Would be the way I would look at it. But
yeah, I mean, I think if we keep in mind that none of the big challenges facing journalism are primarily technological in nature, and hence none of them will primarily have technological solutions, then every tool can be part of individual journalists and news organizations' attempt to do the forms of journalism that citizens will engage with and value. And I think Alex has provided a number of powerful examples of specific uses where Bitcoin can play an important role there. And I think it's really, really important, just to amplify what you said towards the end, Alex, to recognize that this is yet another case of what was called sort of Malvin Kranzberg's first law of technology, right? That technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. As with discussions around encryption, I think it's for each of us to think about when moral entrepreneurs who want to scare us and who want to centralize power, tell us, oh, we must protect the children and we must protect this, that, and the other, and therefore you should trust me and the spooks to have a backdoor to this, to be able to track this and whatnot. We just have to think about, is that a level of confidence we have in those men in suits? That we want to surrender that, and do we believe on balance that they will always and everywhere consistently deploy that in our own best interest? And I think we can, each of us, make up our own mind about that. And in that sense, I think my own sort of very sort of unscientific personal rule of thumb, whenever I'm asked to sort of form a view on any tool or technology or platform company, is very simple in a way. It is, if the Chinese Communist Party is trying to ban it, or if Vladimir Putin is trying to ban it, or if other autocrats or dictators around the world are trying to ban it or force it to act on their behalf, on balance, that thing is probably something that empowers individuals vis-a-vis the state. I think we have reasons to remember there is a reason that Hobbes called the state Leviathan, and it's been the primary threat to individual liberties throughout most of our history.
yeah, one quick follow-up would be with regard to the functionality. We should mention the fact that more than 2 billion people are currently living under double-digit inflation today. And now it's finally, it's coming to Europe. It's a reality for people in my country, here in the UK. And in other countries, it's been far, far worse. So I talked to some Cuban journalists who started using Bitcoin in early 2020. Had they not, they would have lost 90% of all their value because the peso is hyperinflated. So they were able to access something that's certainly been volatile. It's been up and down, but it's been way up since early 2020, so it's been helpful for them, right? They can also access dollars now without ID, which is huge, through Tether. So just remember, if you're in Lebanon or Palestine or Cuba or Iran, you can get dollars now. That's a big deal for people who are losing 90%, 80%, 70% of their value over 1 or 2 years. So there's multiple reasons why journalistic outfits should look at this carefully. Number one, if they're facing any censorship or confiscation risk, but number two, just for the sustainability of their organizations.
But also, number three, the audience that you serve, the readership that you serve, beyond even our roles as journalists, to try to maintain our lives and our livelihood and try to do the work, your readers and your audience is also being affected by the very same thing, which leads me to my last question for you both. In a world in which legacy institutions and the middlemen are being disintermediated by this powerful technology of decentralization. What do we need to know collectively as an audience when we do seek to understand first, when we go beyond the headlines and try to understand what is the power of the impact of blockchain on all of us?
I'll just be very simple. This is a revolutionary technology. It's the separation of money and state, and that deserves our attention. And already, a lot of journalists around the world are taking advantage of it. Again, it's going to have downsides. Everything has a cost, but it's something that you need to add to your arsenal, because we're up against a lot right now.
I'll just say, I think I take my principles for thinking about the future from, the best kinds of sci-fi and speculative fiction, right? Mediocre sci-fi predicts the car, great sci-fi predicts the traffic jam. There will always be new intermediaries. Every form of decentralization will be followed by a period of centralization. So I think the big question is, who will be the new intermediaries, and who will have them under their control or be able to influence them? And of course, this is why authoritarian governments in particular are so focused on this. It's because they want to be the intermediaries. So the question, I think, is who are going to be the new intermediaries, and what form of governance will we want for that? And what have we learned from the last 25 years, where I think, frankly, we can say, we probably haven't had the sort of media governance that we have aspired to as a society, and maybe we want something better for the future.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Angel.